Welcome to Historically Speaking. Hello, my name's Tom Carpenter, and I will be your host for today's program. Today's program will be on the influenza of Rutland in 1918. With me in the studio today is Michael Dwyer. Michael.
Hi, Tom.
Welcome.
Thank you.
This influenza of 1918, this is sort of a related show that you did previously on the health of the city of Rutland in 1903. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. Just to make some comparisons, Tom, to understand why it's so important that we look at what happened with the influenza epidemic in Rutland. As we said in 1903, the greatest single number of deaths in any one age category are going to be children 1 year of age and under, and that's still going to be true in 1917, 1918, and so on. To give us a comparison here, in the year 1917 in the city of Rutland, there were a total of 252 deaths. There were 130 men, 122 women. There had been a scarlet fever epidemic in the month of February that resulted in many of those deaths. In the year 1918, because of the flu epidemic, we had a spike in the total number of deaths up to 278, 158 men, 120 women. So that spike in the death rate at a time when many people were out of the city of Rutland because of their involvement in World War I tells us how significant that is. Then in 1919, the total number of deaths went down to 240. So we're going to be looking at who the people were, some of the families involved that were impacted by that flu epidemic. In coping with the flu epidemic, we're also going to be looking at the role of Rutland Hospital, because Rutland Hospital, which opened on Nichols Street at the end of the 19th century, opened with roughly half a dozen beds in its facility. By 1918, the hospital had doubled in size to about 24 beds. So with 24 beds, it was no way equipped to deal with the crisis that was soon pending. In the city report for the year 1918, they described the fact that there had been 75 hospital patients in that year, and the average weekly expense for a hospital patient was $14 a week. And $14 a week, of course, doesn't sound like a whole lot to us today, but probably many people in 1918 weren't even making $14 a week. It was probably more in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 a week, so the cost really was in proportion to people's income at the time. And of course, there weren't any insurance plans at that time, too. So we need to keep that cost factor in mind when we look at that.
Mm-hmm. What can you tell us now about the influenza epidemic?
Well, to understand how people in Rutland were in fact impacted by this, I think we need to look at what the flu epidemic was and how it started. Altogether, there were 675,000 people who would die in this epidemic. 675,000 people, more than the total population of Vermont right now. This was a worldwide epidemic. There would be some 30 million people who died worldwide in this. This is something that raged while the United States was involved in World War I. So if we just make a comparison for a moment to the number of people who died in the flu epidemic compared to battle deaths in World War I, we had about, in the little more than a year that we were involved overseas in fighting World War I, 53,000 battle deaths. We would have 63,000 deaths from disease. And I estimate that many of those soldiers who died of disease in World War I, in fact, died from influenza. The name that it's called in the records, the Spanish influenza, gives Spain a bad rap, because this flu has nothing to do with Spain at all. And most scientists and forensic medicine specialists believe that the flu actually started in Kansas, in Fort Riley, Kansas, at an Army camp in March of 1918, when all of a sudden there were 500 cases with all the classic flu-like symptoms of high fever, pneumonias, and very, very rapid onset of death. And this flare-up in Fort Riley in March of 1918 resulted within 2 days of 48 people dying. So as fast as this virus flared up in Kansas, it dissipated quickly. And what we now know is the soldiers who had been undergoing basic training in Fort Riley went to Europe. And in the course of their taking the virus with them to Europe, the virus again mutated, and what's going to happen is the strain of the virus became that much more virulent that when it came back to the United States that summer, probably was transported on troop ships coming home. That's one of the things that added to the lethal nature of the flu. It was a virus, we know that now. It was a virus that was too small to be seen by the existing microscopes that we had in 1918. It had been incorrectly identified as a bacteria, so there really wasn't a whole lot that people could do as far as giving the patients medicine. At the time that Rutland really starts to experience this epidemic, which was in October of 1918, nationwide 195,000 people died in the month of October 1918. 195,000 people.
That's quite a bit.
That's quite a bit. That has to be the deadliest single month in American history at any time, and it's certainly more in 1 month than virtually all of the 20th century battle deaths, just the total number of people who died in that time. It is said that everyone alive in 1918 lost some family member. I didn't lose anyone in my immediate family, but I do know from checking the records that my grandfather had 2 young cousins that were roughly his age in their 20s. One died in Newport, Rhode Island, when he was stationed at the Navy base, and then another cousin died in Fort Selma, Alabama, when he was in boot camp getting ready to go to World War II. And you were mentioning before we started taping today that you lost some people in that epidemic as well.
Yes, an aunt and an uncle, a brother, sister, died within days of one another down in Baldwinsville, Massachusetts.
What I really wanted to do was look at some of the Rutland people who were impacted by all of this. And in fact, the very first recorded death certificate in the city of Rutland Vault of someone who died of influenza was a man named Joseph E. Raymond, who was in his early 20s, whose body was shipped home. So the first way that influenza is coming into Rutland are bodies that are being shipped home. And I think it's worthwhile us looking at how the Army actually unwittingly spread this virus, because one of the raging centers of the virus in the final months of World War I was troops that were coming home and that were what's the word when you come out of the Army, when you're mustering out, when you're discharged, and you would muster out at Fort Devens. And of course, not understanding the full nature of a virus, and you have men who were sleeping in dormitory fashion, sometimes 60 to 90 people in a dormitory. This was a fulminating breeding ground for viruses to simply wreak their havoc. And that's what happened. There were scores of people dying in places like Fort Devens. And as the epidemic started to spread, there were 851 people who died in New York City on a single day. Philadelphia would be another city that would be exceptionally hard hit. And in Philadelphia, the death rate would have been 700 times more than normal. And one of the things that I think will really give us a vivid idea of the symptoms of all of this, I have a letter that I would like to read part of that was written by a doctor stationed at Fort Devens during World War I. And you can just hear in this the despair that he has of being a medical doctor and not really able to alleviate much of the suffering. He says, "This epidemic started about 4 weeks ago and has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized and all ordinary work is held up. The men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe or influenza, and when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later, you begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over their face. It is only a matter of a few hours until death comes. It is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. One can stand to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but these poor men are dropping like flies, and it gets on my nerves. We have been averaging over 100 deaths a day." So people who have written about these deaths in places like Fort Riley and Camp Devens were actually more demoralized by what they were seeing than the actual battle deaths in World War I, because so many people were dropping like flies. In the month of October, in the city of Rutland, we had over 710 cases in Rutland. And as this started to unfold, the public health officer, Dr. Roosevelt, would have been ordering signs like this to be displayed in homes to quarantine these people. And it was interesting to see how some of this actually unfolded in Rutland. And I spent some time looking at the Rutland Herald just to see how this national epidemic was being covered. And it was rare in those days in the Rutland Herald, which in 1918, by the way, cost 3 cents.
3 cents.
It was a slightly larger paper in format, much bigger this way, not as many pages. On the average, it was about 8 pages. So as I started to look through the Rutland Herald to follow some of the local way that this story was reported, you almost never would see local news on the front page of the Rutland Herald. On September 28th, on page 8 of the Rutland Herald, the headline was 6,824 new cases of influenza. And it's never on the front page the concern about Rutland during the flu epidemic. For example, on the 2nd of October, in the city news page, which would have been on page 6 of the newspaper, it talked about the number of cases starting to spread in Rutland. There were school closings, and they were tremendously concerned about the shortage of nurses working in 18-hour shifts. So as this starts to escalate and we look at over 700 cases breaking out in Rutland in October, and we only have a dozen beds or so in the hospital, you can figure out it must have been not quite chaotic, but it must have been tremendously frustrating for the people who were trying to minister to the needs of the sick. The fact that they must have just been literally lined up in the hallways on stretchers, and there were actually some people who were frustrated by the fact that the hospital was so full, they figured they would just take their chances and stay home. One of the things about this epidemic that made it a high impact epidemic is that the majority of the people who died were in the prime of life. So you have young mothers and young fathers dying. Here are some of the people that we know died in the epidemic. I mentioned Mr. Raymond and his body coming home from Fort Devens. Another Rutland man, Irving Brooks, 34 years old, had been a Navy clerk in the Navy Yard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. His body was shipped home another Navy employee, Mary Fitzgerald, coming home from Portland. And just a sampling of the names of the people who are dying in the month of October. Edwin Squires, 30 years old, on the 14th of October. Matilda Miller, age 50, on October 16th. Bernard Donnelly, 36 years old. Earl Morse, 26 years old, on the 17th of October. Bess Ward, 29, the 18th of October. Mabel Eddy, 39 years old, on the 24th of October, and so on. And one of the things that I'm going to get to in a little bit is the story of what happened to two particular families when they lost their mother in that epidemic. By the 5th of October, Dr. Roosevelt, the city health officer, began to be very angry at people here in the city because they were not obeying the Board of Health regulations. And even though all public gatherings were banned, and they are saying things like no fraternal organizations to be meeting, people aren't paying much attention. And one of the things that I was a little bit amused by, but you have to look at it in the context of its time, is that on the 7th of October in the Rutland Herald, on page 7, there was an article, perhaps 4 or 5 inches long, about the influenza cure that was posted. The influenza cure that came from someone who had a great deal of experience working with epidemics. And there were two possibilities for you, so you could choose what they were. The first was a mustard poultice, so a poultice that was mixed up with mustard and paste, and you would apply it very liberally to the back of your neck and to your stomach, and that was said to have done wonders.
That sounds good.
The other one is 1 teaspoon of compound licorice dissolved in boiling water, and the advice is drink the water as hot as you can understand it. And the Rutland Herald was very careful to say that this wasn't scientifically endorsed, but they simply say, we want to present this as a public service by someone who has had some experience. And when you think of how desperate people were, and here are people who are in the prime of life, just dying very, very suddenly, perhaps it calmed them to think that this would do them some good. Compared to many other sections of the country, when you look at the fact that we have about 36 deaths in the month of October out of 700 some cases, that's a very high survival rate compared to a lot of other cities. So that's something that I leave to the medical historians to figure out why perhaps in Rutland people's death rate once succumbing to the flu would not be as high as it was in other sections of the country.
Must be the hardy Vermonters.
Perhaps, but there were many hardy Vermonters that succumbed to this virus. Once again, as the story unfolds in the Rutland Herald, we also hear the plea for more nurses. There were absolutely not enough nurses. One story described E.G. McClellan, who was a Rutland druggist at that time. He was one of the people who maintained a registry of private duty nurses, and every nurse that was available was out on the street just trying to make brief visits to the homes that were quarantined. They were trying to isolate people as much as possible, make sure that they had bed rest, etc. But once someone had succumbed to the flu, whether or not they were suffering the symptoms at home or whether or not they were at the city hospital, there wasn't a whole lot that could be done for them. By the end of October, the flu abated, and then of course the fact that there had been such a tremendous epidemic gets obscured by the fact that November 11th, the armistice is signed, the war is over, so people were jubilant about that. And then, very insidiously, in January, it reared its head once again, and once again people were starting to drop like flies. And I would like to tell the story of two families, both of whom lost their mother in January of 1919. The first is on the 24th of January. Antonetta Franzoni Paul, wife of Dominic Paul, 34 years old, the mother of 3 young children, was brought into Rutland Hospital. She would be dead within several hours. This left her husband, who incidentally, I was talking to Mr. Paul's son, Dominic Paul, a few days ago, and he told me that his father was already supporting the family of his older brother, Felix, who had brought him over here from Italy as a young man. He was already supporting Felix's widow and their 3 children, because Felix died very young, several years before, and now he loses his wife. And when one family member, one parent like that died at that time, it often would leave the children virtual orphans, because the parent, Dominic Paul, who I believe was a tailor, still had to go back to work. So who would take care of his children? And in fact, what happened with Dominic Paul's children is that he moved in with his in-laws. Now, I don't know if he was living with the in-laws or in the same house at the time that this happened, but at the time of the 1920 census, we have Dominic Paul's mother-in-law taking care of the Paul children, and then within a few years, Dominic Paul would remarry, and that family would stay intact. So the Pauls were fortunate in that the children weren't sent to an orphanage. But in another instance of a young woman who died just hours after Mrs. Paul, her name was Abby Dunheen. She lived on East Street. She was 26 years old. She had, at that point, 3 children. She had a daughter from an earlier marriage who was about 7 years old. She had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And her daughter, whom I knew well, remembers her mother being taken out of the house, her mother crying. They were taking her to Rutland Hospital, and Abby knew that it was a one-way trip to the hospital. As we said in our earlier show, no slight on the hospital, but very few people at this time came out of the hospital alive. So Abby, in fact, died that day at the hospital, 26 years old. Her husband, Patrick Dunheen, who worked for the electric company, of course, still had to maintain his job. Mm-hmm. His children then went to live with their maternal grandmother. Within a year, she was dying of cancer, so the children got shuffled around once again. They were split up, and the daughter, Cassie Dunheen Parsons, whom I knew well, ended up going to be raised by one of her father's cousins who brought her up. And by a remarkable coincidence, and I wonder how many times this happened, when Cassie grew up, she would marry a man who lost both his mother and his father in that same flu epidemic. So Cassie's children would not know 3 out of their 4 grandparents because they all died in the same flu epidemic. And those are just 2 examples, 2 stories of how lives were permanently impacted by this. But since it's something that came so quickly and went over 85 years ago, there are probably many other stories out there that only exist in family lore, and we will probably inspire some readers, I hope, to recall if there is a flu story buried somewhere in their past.
You mentioned it reared itself up again in January. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's because the soldiers were coming home from overseas at that time?
I think so, and I also think it's due to the sneaky nature of viruses and how viruses mutate. And when you look at viral diseases today, just when you think that the virus has been eradicated, a new strain of it appears. And there were, in fact, when I was reading carefully through the number of deaths in January of 1919, there were people who had really never gotten over the first bout of it. And one woman in particular, Mary Perry, who died on the 14th of January, on her death certificate it said had flu and pneumonia in October, and she's dying in January. So I think that some of those people perhaps had a milder form of the virus, and then the virus really fulminated in January.
Why do you think so many people have forgotten about this epidemic?
The fact that this epidemic was played out in the context of the war, and all of the headlines were, we knew that we were closing in on the Germans, and it shows you it truly was a different time, because it would say Johnny Yank is going to beat the Hun at any time. So the headlines were filled with war news. That was the lead story at the time. This was secondary. I think the reason that people don't remember is that we remember our war dead because we have focused times of remembrance for them. And when you think of the fact that within a short time, the day of the armistice, November 11th, 1918, within a dozen years or so, would be turned into Veterans Day. We already had Decoration Day becoming Memorial Day by this time, so we would remember our people who died in war. But there's no such thing as an epidemic Remembrance Day. And even though we have noted the commemoration, such as the 50th anniversary of the flu epidemic, the 75th anniversary, it's not the type of thing that lends itself to people talking about that. And I think that people who lived through this, particularly losing a parent, losing a child, families splitting up, it's not something that people are going to want to talk about. People, as you know, of a different generation than we are, were much more reticent in talking about personal sorrow than we are today.
Yeah, it's you're right. I mean, a lot of people died. It was all over the United States, all around the world, but it wasn't a thing that lend itself to be earmarked like the war ending or anything. And again, you said it was all like on the back page, or it was buried in the newspaper, wasn't brought to the face of the newspaper.
And I leave it to our viewers out there to tell me whether I'm right or wrong on this one. But the overall population of Vermont went down from 1910 to 1920. It's one of the few states in the country that lost total population. Some people allege it's due to the flu epidemic. Other people allege that many people after the war moved. So that remains something that we'll have to explore further. Why, by the time of the 1920 census, we had fewer people in Vermont? Was it because of the flu? Who knows?
Well, maybe there'll be a future program if we can get some answers on that.
We'll see. We'll see.
Well, Michael, once again, I want to thank you very much for this. And to the viewers out there, I hope this has been very educational to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
And have a great day. Thank you.